The first thing Ethan Carter noticed was the smell of burnt coffee. The second thing he noticed was that he was, impossibly 27 minutes late for a meeting he still had a right to attend, an ordinary Tuesday that, in the life he remembered, sat exactly 13 months before the phone call that ended everything. He stood frozen in the lobby of the Prudential Tower, coffee cup crushed in one fist, brown liquid dripping between his fingers and pooling on marble, so polished he could see the panic on his own upside-down face. Around him, Boston's financial district moved at its usual brisk, indifferent pace, heels clicking, phones chiming, the electronic chirp of turnstiles swallowing badge after badge. Everything was exactly as it had been before. Before the funeral, before the disgrace, before the last text message Nate had ever sent him, 4 words glowing on a cracked phone screen at 2 a.m, the number disconnected an hour after. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Goodbye, sir. You're going to want to let go of that cup," said a voice behind him, dry as good bourbon. Structural integrity's a myth at this point. Ethan turned around, and his heart did something it hadn't done. He did the math without meaning to, the way he'd done it every single morning since, 412 days. The exact distance between right now and the night that text message had lit up his phone. Nathaniel Hayes was standing by the elevator bank in a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who never had to think about money. One eyebrow raised, dark hair falling just slightly out of place over his forehead. He looked infuriatingly amused. He looked 29 years old and completely, devastatingly alive. At the office, almost nobody called him Nathaniel. Ever since his rowing days at Dartmouth, when he'd made himself captain by sheer force of showing up earlier and yelling louder than anyone else, his teammates had nicknamed him Alpha, and it had followed him from the boathouse to the trading floor, half mocking, half true. He commanded rooms without seeming to try. He was 29, a senior analyst at Whitfield Cross Capital, and he had, in the life Ethan remembered, taken the blame for a $300 million trading loss that was never his fault, walked out of that building with his reputation in ashes, and disappeared from Ethan's life so completely that Ethan had spent a year not sure if grief was even the right word for what he felt, because you weren't supposed to grieve someone you'd never had the courage to love out loud. And now Nate was standing 3 feet away, holding 2 coffees, looking at Ethan like he'd grown a second head. "You're staring," Nate said. "You're alive," Ethan blurted. Nate blinked. "Statistically, yes. Ethan, did you hit your head? You've got coffee on your..." He gestured vaguely at Ethan's entire ruined shirt front. "Everywhere, actually." The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful chime that felt, to Ethan, obscenely out of place, like a birthday jingle playing at a funeral. He didn't move. He couldn't. His hands were shaking. And it wasn't from the coffee burn spreading warm and forgotten across his knuckles. "Ethan." Nate's voice had dropped, the teasing edge gone. He stepped closer than colleagues usually stood, close enough that Ethan could smell cedar and clean laundry, a smell that used to mean safe, back when Ethan let himself think in those terms. "Hey, you're actually freaking me out a little." "Say something normal," Ethan told himself. "You are a functioning adult. You have not, in fact, been flung backward through time by whatever cruel physics decided you deserved a second chance. Say something normal." What came out instead was, "Don't take the Meridian trade next month." Nate's brow furrowed. "The what?" "The Meridian Resources short position. Whitfield's going to push everyone to load up on it in October, and it's going to blow up, and when it does, Weller is going to make sure your name is on every memo and his isn't on any of them, and you're going to take the fall for the whole desk because you actually think loyalty means something in that building." Ethan's voice cracked on the last word. "Don't, please. Just don't let them put your name on it." For a long moment, Nate said nothing. The elevator doors, having waited a polite interval, slid shut again without either of them inside. "Okay," Nate said slowly, and there was something new in his face now, something careful. "First, how do you know about Meridian? That desk hasn't even opened a position yet. Second," he tilted his head, studying Ethan the way he might study a chart that refused to make sense. "Are you worried about me?" Ethan laughed, a short, wrecked sound, half a sob dressed up as a joke. You have no idea. He hadn't meant to say the next part. He would blame it, later, on 412 days of missing someone he was never supposed to have loved in the first place, on the particular vertigo of watching a dead man reach out and pressed the elevator button like it was nothing. Like the world hadn't ended and quietly, mercifully, started over. "I loved you," Ethan said. "I never told you, and then you were gone, and I have been living with that for over a year, and I refuse, to let it happen again. So laugh if you want. Report me to HR, I don't care, I'm not going to sit on this a second time." The lobby went on being a lobby around them, a security guard's radio crackling, someone's rolling suitcase clattering over the seam in the marble, while Nathaniel Hayes stood very still, with 2 coffees going cold in his hands, and stared at Ethan Carter like he was trying to solve for a variable that had just walked directly into frame. "Ethan," he said finally, and his voice had gone soft in a way Ethan had never once heard it go. Not in 3 years of knowing him, not in 3 years of pretending 3 years wasn't long enough to fall for your best friend. "You're saying loved. Past tense." Of all the things to fixate on, Ethan let out a wet, disbelieving laugh. "That's what you got out of that?" "I'm an analyst," Nate said. "I read the numbers that matter." He set both coffees down on the ledge by the security desk, with a care that seemed entirely unnecessary for cups he was clearly done drinking from, and then he closed the last 3 feet of distance between them. And he was close enough now that Ethan had to tip his head back to hold his gaze. "Try it again. Present tense this time. I want to hear you get it right." Ethan's pulse was doing something arrhythmic and foolish. Around them, the lobby's fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere behind the security desk, a radio played something with a bass line. None of it mattered. The only thing in the whole marble-floored, coffee-stained, second-chance world that mattered was the 4 inches of space between his mouth and Nate's. "I love you," Ethan said. Present tense, ongoing. Really annoyingly persistent, actually, given that you apparently faked your own death just to avoid hearing it. "I didn't fake anything. I have literally never left this building before 9 a.m. in my life." "Not yet," Ethan said, and something about the word made Nate go very quiet. "You haven't left yet." And before either of them could dissect that particular grammar, Nate kissed him. It wasn't elegant. Ethan still had coffee soaking through his shirt, and Nate still had one hand full of nothing, hovering uselessly in the air like he hadn't planned this far ahead. Which, Ethan understood later, he genuinely hadn't. Nathaniel Hayes being a man who planned trades 6 moves in advance, and absolutely nothing about his own heart. But it was warm, and it was real. And when they broke apart, the security guard behind the desk was very deliberately not looking at them while grinning at his phone. "So," Nate said, a little breathless, forehead resting against Ethan's, "explain the Meridian thing. And the past tense thing, and actually all of it. From the top. That," Ethan said, "is going to take longer than the ride up to 42. Nate glanced at the elevator, then back at him, then, decisively, pulled his phone out and typed something with his thumb. "What are you doing?" "Telling my 10 a.m. "I'm sick," Nate said. "You're going to sit down. I'm going to get you a shirt from my locker that doesn't smell like a Duncan explosion, and you're going to tell me everything. In order. Starting with why you looked at me like I'd come back from the dead." Ethan huffed out something between a laugh and a sob, wiped his face with the back of his wrist, and let himself, for the first time in 412 days, believe that he might actually get to keep this. "Deal," he said. "But you're buying me a new coffee. This one's dead to me." They ended up on the loading dock behind the building, sitting on an overturned milk crate that had clearly been someone's unofficial smoke break throne for a decade. Nate in his undershirt with his dress shirt draped over Ethan's ruined one, and Ethan trying to figure out how much of the truth a sane person could survive hearing. "I'm not going to tell you I traveled back in time," Ethan said. "You'll think I need a psych eval." "I already think you need a psych eval," Nate said easily, arms crossed, sunlight catching the dark stubble he hadn't shaved yet. "Try me anyway." So Ethan tried him, carefully, in pieces, watching Nate's face for the moment it would crack into disbelief. He talked about the version of this year where Whitfield Cross had pushed the whole derivatives desk into the Meridian short, where the position had cratered when a regulatory ruling nobody saw coming had gone the wrong way, where $300 million had evaporated in 11 trading days. He talked about how Weller, the desk head, a man with a smile like a car salesman, and the moral spine of wet cardboard, had quietly scrubbed his own name off every internal memo and left Nate's on all of them, because Nate had been the one who'd actually executed the trades, because Nate had trusted him, because Nate, infuriating, loyal, idiot Nate, had refused to name names when compliance came asking, had taken the fall alone rather than drag 3 junior analysts down with him. "You'd have done it too," Nate said quietly. When Ethan got to that part, it wasn't a question. "That's not the point." "It's a little bit the point." Ethan pressed on before he lost his nerve. He talked about the 6 months after. Nate's name across the financial trades pages, the quiet blacklisting, the apartment Nate had stopped answering his phone in, the night Ethan had shown up with Thai food and no plan, and found the place empty, sublet to someone else, Nate's forwarding address a P.O. box that bounced every letter Ethan was too much of a coward to actually send. He didn't mention the last part. The phone call 11 months later, the number he didn't recognize, a stranger's voice explaining, gently, that there had been an accident on a stretch of coastal highway outside Providence. And did Ethan know how to reach Nathaniel Hayes' family? He didn't mention the funeral in Connecticut, tiny and strange, Nate's sister's face gray with a grief Ethan had no right to share so publicly. Some things, he decided, a person got to keep to himself, even in a second chance, especially in a second chance. "And then I woke up," Ethan said instead, "in my apartment, on a Tuesday I'd already lived through, wearing pajamas I gave to Goodwill 8 months ago, and I came here because some part of me thought if I saw you get in that elevator I'd know sure I'd lost it completely." Nate was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere above them, a delivery truck's hydraulic lift groaned and hissed. "You believe all of that, not a challenge," said. Not do you believe it? An observation." "Yes. Okay." Ethan blinked. "Okay?" "I'm not saying I believe you traveled through time, Ethan. I'm an analyst. I need more than a vibes-based data set." A ghost of a smile. "But I believe you believe it. And I believe you knew about a Meridian short before that desk's even finished modeling it, which either means you've got a source inside my firm feeding you information nobody should have, or something considerably weirder is going on. Either way." He reached over and took Ethan's hand, turned it palm up, traced one finger slowly along the faint burn mark the coffee had left. "Either way, I'd rather believe the weird thing and keep you close than call you crazy and lose whatever this is. That's disturbingly reasonable of you. I told you. I read the numbers that matter." He laced their fingers together, and something in Ethan's chest, tight and aching since he'd opened his eyes that morning in a life he thought he'd lost forever, finally, blessedly loosened. "So tell me what I do instead. When Weller comes around asking who wants the Meridian book, you say no," Ethan said. "You say it's outside your risk mandate. You make him put it in writing whose idea it was." Nate huffed a laugh, low and surprised, like the plan delighted him purely on its cheek. "You want me to paper trail my own boss. I want you to still be here in October," Ethan said, and heard his own voice go thin. "I want a version of this year where I don't have to identify your—" He stopped himself, throat closing. Nate's thumb stilled against his knuckles. "Where you don't have to what? Nothing." Ethan shook his head hard, forced a smile that felt more like armor than joy. "Nothing. I want you here. That's the whole sentence." Nate studied him a moment longer, clearly cataloging the things Ethan wasn't saying for later interrogation, and then, mercifully, let it go. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his mouth to the back of Ethan's, the gesture so unexpectedly tender against the grimy backdrop of a loading dock that Ethan's breath caught. "Okay, Carter," he said. "Weird time loop boyfriend it is. We're not. I didn't say boyfriend." "You said you loved me in a lobby in front of a security guard named Gary," Nate said. "I checked his badge. We are extremely boyfriends. Keep up." Ethan didn't tell Nate about the text message that night on the loading dock. He told him everything else. The trade, the disgrace, the sublet apartment, the P.O. box that swallowed letters without ever sending one back. But the text message he kept, the way you keep a burn scar under a long sleeve, not because you're ashamed of it, but because taking it out and looking at it costs something you can't always afford to spend. He let himself remember it anyway, walking home alone afterward through a Boston that hadn't changed a single storefront since the life he'd lost, streetlights coming on one by one along Newbury Street like the city itself was exhaling. It had come at 2 a.m, 6 months into the blacklisting, 6 months of watching a man he loved get smaller and smaller in increments too slow to argue with. Fewer calls returned, a coffee order forgotten. A joke that used to land, now met with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Ethan had been asleep. He remembered the phone lighting the ceiling of his old apartment blue, remembered fumbling for it half-conscious, expecting nothing, expecting the ordinary nothing of any other night. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Goodbye." 4 words, no explanation, no number to call back, because by the time Ethan's hands had stopped shaking long enough to dial, the line was already dead, disconnected clean as a wound cauterized shut. He'd told himself, in the weeks that followed, that it was a breakup, a coward's breakup, sent at 2 in the morning by a man who'd never once been a coward about anything else in his life, which was exactly what had made it so hard to accept. He'd told himself Nate simply couldn't stand to be loved by someone, while he was busy hating himself for a scandal that was never his fault. That shame does that to people, hollows them out until the kindest thing they can imagine doing for the people who love them is disappearing. He hadn't known that night that it wasn't a breakup at all. He hadn't known that 5 months later a stranger's voice on the phone would explain, gently, procedurally, the particular geography of a stretch of Route 1 outside Providence, the rain, the guardrail, the report that used words like single vehicle and time of death in the same flattened tone a person might use to read a grocery list. He hadn't known that the 4 words weren't goodbye in the way he'd assumed. They were goodbye in the truest, cruelest way there was. A man trying, badly, at 2 in the morning, alone and ashamed, and already halfway gone in some direction, Ethan never got to ask about, to spare the person he loved from watching the rest of it happen. Ethan had spent 412 days believing he understood exactly what those 4 words meant. Standing now, on a sidewalk that still smelled like September even though, in the life he remembered, September had already come and gone twice. He understood he'd had it backward the whole time. It hadn't been goodbye, I don't love you enough to stay. It had been goodbye, I love you too much to let you watch. He wasn't going to let either version happen again. Not the trade, not the text. Not the version of Nathaniel Hayes who thought disappearing quietly was a kindness instead of the cruelest thing he could possibly do to the people who'd have crossed an ocean, or a decade, or apparently a second chance at time itself, just to keep him. Not this time, Ethan thought, and meant it with the particular ferocity of a man who has already lost, once, everything he refuses to lose again. This time you don't get to disappear on me. This time I'm not letting go of your hand long enough for you to try. Word travels fast in a building full of people whose entire job is noticing patterns before anyone else does, and by Thursday, half of Whitfield Cross Capital's 42nd floor had opinions about the fact that Nathaniel Hayes had shown up to the Monday trading huddle, wearing another man's coffee-scented dress shirt underneath his blazer, and had spent the whole meeting smiling at his phone like an idiot. "Absolutely not," said Priya Nazari, dropping into the seat across from Ethan in the firm's cafeteria with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been Ethan's closest friend since their first week at Boston College, and had therefore earned the right to interrogate him without warning. She was 28, sharp-featured, currently 3 years into a compliance career she complained about with the fond exhaustion of someone who secretly loved catching people breaking rules. "Do not eat that sandwich and act casual with me. I want the whole story right now, in chronological order." "There's no story," Ethan said, around a mouthful of sandwich that immediately betrayed him by tasting like guilt. "Nate Hayes wore your shirt to a 9 a.m. It's his shirt. I was wearing his shirt. Even worse." Priya leaned forward, delighted. "You two finally figured it out. I have been watching you pine after that man's stupid perfect jawline for 3 years, Ethan Carter. 3 years. I nearly organized an intervention." "You did organize an intervention. In February, there was a whiteboard." "The whiteboard was thorough and well-researched," Priya said with dignity. "So, details now. I need something to get me through the quarterly audit." Ethan gave her the sanitized version. The elevator, the confession, the shirt, carefully skirting anything involving time loops and funerals in Connecticut, and watched Priya's face move through delight, vindication, and finally something softer and more sincere. "I'm happy for you," she said, quieter now, reaching over to squeeze his wrist. "You've had this look for a while, like you were waiting for something bad to happen. It's nice to see it gone." Ethan's smile faltered for half a second before he caught it. If only she knew how right she was. Across the cafeteria, a burst of laughter drew his eye. Nate, surrounded by 3 of his desk colleagues, gesturing with a fork like it was a pointer in a very serious presentation. Beside him, unmistakable even from across the room, sat his sister. Well, not literally beside him in the building. Ethan had met Marissa Hayes exactly twice in the life he remembered, both times briefly, both times struck by how she managed to be both softer and more terrifying than her brother. But it was her voice he heard now, ringing clear across the cafeteria as she barreled through the door in scrubs, clearly on a break from her R rotation 2 blocks over, beelining for her brother's table with the singular focus of a woman who had skipped lunch to make a point. "Marissa," Ethan said aloud before he could stop himself. Priya raised an eyebrow. "You know Nate's sister?" "I know she cried so hard at his funeral a nurse had to bring her water," Ethan thought, and swallowed hard against the memory. "We've met," he said instead, briefly. Marissa Hayes, 26, third-year emergency medicine resident at Mass General, had her brother's dark hair and none of his patience, and she demonstrated this immediately by smacking Nate on the back of the head with a rolled-up chart before dropping into the seat beside him. "You didn't tell me you were dating someone," she said, loud enough to carry. "I had to hear it from Tyler in radiology, who heard it from Gary the security guard, who apparently has a whole subplot going about you two in the lobby." "It's new," Nate said, unbothered, stealing a fry off her tray with the ease of decades of sibling warfare. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "At the wedding?" "Rissa, I'm just saying if this is serious, I need to run a background check. I have hospital resources." She turned, and her sharp dark eyes landed squarely on Ethan across the cafeteria, and for one horrible, vertiginous second Ethan thought she somehow knew. Thought some sixth sense told her that the man across the room had once stood at her brother's grave and hadn't been able to look her in the eye. But her expression only sharpened with curious interest, entirely uncomplicated. "That him? Carter? From the coffee thing? That's him," Nate said, and something about the way he said it, easy, proud, a little smug, made Ethan's chest ache in the good way this time. "Bring him to Sunday dinner," Marissa announced. "Already standing, already stealing one more fry. Mom wants to interrogate him about his intentions. I want to interrogate him about whether he's actually funny or just funny by comparison to you, which is a low bar, frankly. Get back to the ER, doctor." "Hayes," Nate called after her, and she flipped him off without turning around, white coat swinging as she vanished through the cafeteria doors. "So," Priya said into the ensuing silence, watching Ethan's face with open glee. "Sunday dinner. Meeting the family. This is serious, serious." Ethan, still watching the door Marissa had disappeared through, found he couldn't quite speak past the lump in his throat. In the life he remembered, he had met that family exactly once more after that, in black, in a chapel that smelled like too many white lilies, standing in a receiving line he had no right to be part of, murmuring condolences to a woman who had no idea he'd loved her brother, no idea he'd give anything, to trade places with whoever had been driving that night. Not this time. This time he was going to sit across from her at a dinner table and eat whatever her mother made and complain about her brother's terrible taste in ties and get to keep every single ordinary, unbearably precious minute of it. "Yeah," Ethan said when he trusted his voice again. "Serious, serious." Sunday dinner happened in a craftsman house in Newton with a wraparound porch and a mother, Diane Hayes, who took one look at Ethan standing on her doorstep with a bottle of wine and a box of pastries from Mike's, and declared, "Oh, thank God he brought cannoli, he's staying," before Ethan had even said hello. The evening was, against every anxious expectation Ethan had built up over the drive, easy. The house smelled like rosemary and browned butter, like a kitchen that had cooked 1,000 ordinary Sunday dinners and intended to cook 1,000 more, and something in Ethan's chest loosened the moment he stepped through the door and heard a radio playing low jazz from somewhere upstairs. Diane grilled him, gently, over pot roast, with the surgical precision of a woman who had clearly done this before, about his work, his family, his intentions, and seemed satisfied by his answers in a way that made Nate visibly relax across the table, one hand finding Ethan's knee under the tablecloth like he needed the reassurance of touch as much as Ethan did. Marissa spent the meal alternating between roasting her brother's college haircut choices and demanding embarrassing stories about him, most of which Nate tried unsuccessfully to veto. And twice Ethan caught himself laughing so hard at a story about Nate's disastrous freshman year attempt at rowing crew that he nearly choked on a mouthful of mashed potatoes, and Diane had to thump him on the back while Marissa cackled and Nate buried his red face in both hands. It wasn't until after dinner, when Ethan found himself alone in the kitchen drying dishes while Diane put leftovers away, that the conversation turned. "He's different with you," Diane said, not looking up from the Tupperware she was wrestling a lid onto. "Lighter. I don't know how else to put it. Different how? He's always been someone who takes on everyone else's weight," Diane said, "since he was a kid. His father left when he was 11, and Nathaniel decided, all on his own, nobody asked him to, that it was his job to make sure Marissa and I were all right. He's been doing some version of that ever since, at work, with his friends, everywhere, taking the hit so someone else doesn't have to." She finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp in a way that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of her daughter. "I worry about that in him, that instinct. It's a beautiful thing until it isn't." Ethan's hands stilled on the plate he was drying. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm working on it." "Working on what?" "Making sure it isn't him alone next time," Ethan said. "Whatever the next time is." Diane studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then, unexpectedly, she reached over and squeezed his forearm, the same gesture Priya had made in the cafeteria, the universal shorthand of women who loved someone fiercely and recognized the same fierceness in a stranger. "Good," she said simply, and went back to the Tupperware, and the conversation was, apparently, over. Later, driving back into the city, with Nate's hand resting easy on his knee, and the radio playing something low and forgettable, Ethan found himself watching the passing lights of the Mass Pike with a feeling he didn't have a name for, something between terror and gratitude, the particular vertigo of a man walking a tightrope he'd already fallen from once, trying to remember exactly where the missing plank had been. "You went quiet," Nate said, glancing over at a red light. "Just thinking? About?" Ethan considered for one reckless second, telling him everything. The accident, the coastal highway, the 11 months, the funeral, all of it. But some instinct, old and protective, held him back. Not yet, not until he'd actually fixed it. He didn't want to hand Nate a countdown clock. He wanted to hand him a future. "About your mom's cannoli theory," Ethan said instead. "I think she might actually love me more than she loves you." Nate laughed, the sound filling up the car, warm and unbothered and alive, and Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second and let himself simply have it. "That tracks," Nate said. "She's had 29 years of me. You're new and exciting. Give it time." Time, Ethan thought. That's exactly the thing I'm trying to steal back. The weeks that followed had a texture Ethan hadn't let himself imagine he'd get to have again. Grocery runs that turned into taste tests standing in the cereal aisle, arguing about marshmallow to cereal ratios. A Saturday spent teaching Nate, badly, to sketch, ending in a portrait of Ethan that looked more like an alarmed potato. The growing, easy habit of falling asleep on the phone with Nate's voice low in his ear, some late-night market recap turning into a lullaby neither of them acknowledged as one. But underneath the sweetness ran a current of dread that never fully receded, because Ethan knew, with the sick certainty of a man who'd already watched this particular ending play out, that September was coming, and September meant Weller, and Weller meant Meridian. The trap began exactly the way Ethan remembered it, quietly, almost politely, over a Tuesday morning desk meeting Ethan wasn't even in the room for, but heard about in exhaustive, furious detail that evening. "He wants me to lead it," Nate said, pacing the small kitchen of his apartment, tie already loosened, hair rumpled from raking his hands through it. "Framed it like an honor, like he's trusting me with it." Weller, Ethan had met him twice, both times feeling the particular chill of shaking hands with a man whose smile never touched his eyes, had assembled the desk that morning and laid out Whitfield Cross's newest conviction trade, a heavily leveraged short position against Meridian Resources, a mid-cap mining company whose stock had been climbing on speculation about a regulatory ruling everyone in the room seemed certain would go against the company. Everyone except Ethan, who knew, with the terrible useless certainty of hindsight, that the ruling would go the other way, that Meridian's stock would spike 30% in a single trading session in late October, and that whoever had their name on the trade would be the one holding the bag when the fund's biggest investors started asking very pointed questions. "You said no," Ethan said. "Not a question." He'd told Nate the plan a dozen times, had made him promise, had watched him nod along with the particular patience of a man humoring a partner's anxiety more than a man actually planning to follow through. "I said I wanted to see the models first," Nate said, which was, Ethan realized with a sinking feeling, not remotely the same thing. Nate, I can't just say no to a direct instruction from my desk head with no justification, Ethan. That's not how this works. That's how you get labeled difficult and passed over for every promotion for the next 5 years. I don't care about your promotion. I care about you not being the only name on that trade when it goes wrong. It's not going to go wrong. We don't even know that yet. All we have is a version of events you say you remember from a life that, forgive me, I still can't fully wrap my head around. Nate stopped himself, visibly, dragging a hand down his face. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Ethan sat very still on the couch, hands folded tight in his lap, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but a bone-deep fear that history, stubborn and indifferent, was going to find its way back onto its rails no matter what he did. You don't believe me, Ethan said quietly. I believe you, Nate said, crossing the room to kneel in front of him, taking both of Ethan's hands in his. I believe that you believe it completely, and I believe that you love me enough to be terrified about something you can't fully explain, and that terrifies me, because I don't know how to fight something I can't see coming. Give me something concrete. A document, a name, an email, anything I can actually use, instead of asking me to torch my career on the strength of a feeling. Ethan opened his mouth and closed it again, because the truth was he had nothing concrete. He had a memory of a headline. He had the particular ache of a phone call on a stretch of highway he was desperate never to think about again. He had nothing that would survive contact with a compliance department. I don't have proof, he admitted. I just have you, and I'm not losing you again. Again, Nate repeated softly, and something in his face shifted, some piece finally sliding into place. You keep saying that, again, like it's already happened. Ethan's breath caught. He'd been so careful. He hadn't meant to let that slip, not yet, not until he had a plan solid enough to make the truth survivable. Nate. What happened to me, Ethan? Nate's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the tone of a man approaching something he suspected might shatter. In the year you remember, what actually happened to me? And Ethan, sitting on the couch of a man he had already buried once, finally unable to bear the weight of the secret alone for one more second, told him the truth. He told it plainly this time, without the softening he'd used before. The accident on Route 1 outside Providence, 11 months after Nate had walked out of Whitfield Cross, with a cardboard box and a ruined name. The rain that night, according to the police report Ethan had read so many times he could recite it. The stranger's voice on the phone. The chapel that smelled like lilies. Diane's face, gray and hollowed out, at the front of a room full of people who hadn't known, the way Ethan hadn't known, how much there had been to lose. Nate didn't move for a long time. He stayed kneeling on the floor, hands still wrapped around Ethan's, his jaw tight, his eyes bright in a way that made Ethan's chest hurt to look at. You watched me die, Nate said finally, voice rough. And you never told me you loved me until you got a second chance to. I was a coward, Ethan said. The first time. I told myself there'd be another opportunity, that it wasn't the right moment, that you probably didn't feel the same way anyway, and then you were gone and there was no more time to be a coward in, and I had to live with that for over a year, every single day, wondering what would have happened if I'd just said something. His voice cracked. So yes, I'm terrified. I am asking you to trust a feeling because a feeling is all I have, and I know that's not fair, and I'm asking anyway, because I would rather be the most annoying, paranoid, overprotective boyfriend in the history of Boston than bury you a second time. Nate was quiet for a long moment, thumb tracing slow, absent circles over Ethan's knuckles. When he finally spoke, his voice had steadied, gone low and sure in the way Ethan remembered from before, the way that had first made him fall, 3 years ago, for a man who commanded rooms without seeming to try. Okay, Nate said. Okay. I believe you. He lifted his head, and his eyes were, but his mouth had found something like resolve. Not because I understand the mechanics of it. I don't. Maybe I never will. But I believe that you loved me enough to carry that alone for weeks rather than scare me. And I believe you're telling me now, because you trust me enough to actually help you fix it instead of just protecting me from a distance. So, he squeezed Ethan's hands. Tell me the plan, the real one, not say no and hope. What do we actually do? Something in Ethan's chest unlocked, a held breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since a Tuesday morning in a coffee-scented lobby. We need paper, Ethan said. Something that puts Weller's fingerprints on this trade in writing. Something compliance can't ignore, so that when it goes wrong, and it will go wrong, there's a trail that leads to him instead of just you. He's not sloppy. He's been doing this for 15 years. He knows exactly how to keep his name clean. Then we make him sloppy, Ethan said. Or we find someone he's already been sloppy with. Nate went quiet, considering, and Ethan watched calculation replace grief in his expression, watched the analyst in him wake back up, sharp and purposeful. There's someone, Nate said slowly. Junior guy on the desk, Marcus Webb. Weller's been leaning on him hard the last few months, pushing him to backdate a couple of trade tickets last quarter. Marcus came to me about it, scared out of his mind, didn't know who else to tell. I told him to sit tight, that I'd handle it quietly. His jaw tightened. I never did anything with it. Didn't want to blow up my own desk over something that felt, at the time, containable. Is he still scared? Terrified, probably. A slow, dangerous smile started to spread across Nate's face, the particular expression Ethan had missed more than he'd realized. The one that meant Nathaniel Hayes had found the shape of a plan and was starting to enjoy it. Terrified people talk to compliance, Ethan. Especially when someone offers to sit in the room with them so they don't have to do it alone. That someone being you. That someone, Nate said, being us. Priya's in compliance, isn't she? Ethan felt a laugh bubble up despite everything, equal parts relief and disbelief. You want to recruit my best friend into a corporate sting operation. I want to recruit your best friend, Nate said, standing, pulling Ethan up with him, into making sure I get to keep living the life you already grieved once. Yes, exactly that. Priya, when approached over lunch 2 days later with the full, unredacted version of events, minus the time travel specifics, which Ethan still couldn't bring himself to say twice in 1 week, did not need much convincing. Marcus Webb, she said, tapping her pen against her legal pad with the barely contained energy of a woman who had been waiting years for a legitimate reason to go after Weller. I've had a file open on that desk's ticket practices for 4 months. Nobody would give me anything solid enough to act on. You already suspected him, Nate said. I suspect everyone, it's my whole personality, Priya said. But yes. Weller's the kind of guy who's very careful right up until he's not, and backdating tickets is exactly the kind of shortcut a man like that takes when he thinks nobody's paying attention. She looked between them, something sharpening in her expression. If Marcus is willing to go on record, and if we can get him to do it before this Meridian trade goes live instead of after, we can build a case that puts institutional pressure on Weller before he ever gets the chance to make you the fall guy. That's the difference between defense and offense, gentlemen. Marcus Webb turned out to be 24 years old, barely a year out of Wharton, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept properly since the day Weller had first asked him to change a timestamp. He met them on a Thursday evening in a coffee shop, 3 blocks from the office, that none of them frequented for exactly this reason, hands wrapped around a mug he never drank from, and it took less than 10 minutes of Nate's steady, patient questioning, the same voice, Ethan realized, that had once talked Ethan through a panic attack at 2 a.m, calm and certain and entirely without judgment. Before Marcus was talking, and once he started, he didn't stop. He told me if I didn't do it, he'd make sure I never worked on the street again, Marcus said, voice shaking. I have loans, I didn't know what else to do. You're not in trouble, Nate said. Not from us. We're trying to make sure the person actually responsible is the one who answers for this. Not you. Not me. Priya slid a manila folder across the table. Blank, official looking. The kind of prop that made everything feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. If you're willing to give a formal statement, with documentation, I can open an internal review that goes over Weller's head before he can pin anything on anyone else. This protects you, Marcus, legally and professionally. But it has to be your choice. Marcus looked at the folder for a long moment, then at Nate, then, finally, at Ethan, a stranger to him, someone he had no particular reason to trust, and something in Ethan's steady, unwavering expression seemed to settle something in the younger man's spine. Okay, Marcus said. Okay, I'll do it. Walking out into the cool September evening afterward, Boston's brownstones glowing amber under streetlights just beginning to flicker on, Nate reached over and laced his fingers through Ethan's, the gesture so casual and so certain that it took Ethan's breath away all over again, months into this, and still not used to the fact that he got to have it. We might actually pull this off, Nate said, a note of wonder in his voice, like he was only now letting himself believe it. "We are absolutely going to pull this off," Ethan said. "I refuse to have come back in time for anything less." Nate laughed, bright and startled, and pulled Ethan in against his side, and for one perfect, unremarkable moment, sidewalk, streetlight, his boyfriend's laugh warm against his temple, Ethan let himself simply exist inside a future he had once thought he'd lost forever. October arrived the way it always did in Boston, abrupt and beautiful, the public gardens' trees turning gold and red almost overnight, the air sharpening into something that smelled like wood smoke even downtown. It also arrived, on schedule, with the Meridian short going live across Whitfield Cross's derivatives desk, Weller's name conspicuously, carefully absent from every internal document, exactly as Ethan remembered. Except this time, there was a difference, a slim, damning paper trail, sitting in a locked compliance file, built patiently over 3 weeks. Marcus Webb's sworn statement about the backdated tickets. A set of internal messages Priya had subpoenaed through legitimate channels once the review was formally opened. And critically, an email Weller himself had sent late one Friday evening, 3 glasses of self-satisfaction into his week, instructing Nate in writing to take point on structuring the Meridian book, use your judgment on sizing. Language specific enough, once the trade blew up, to be very difficult to disown. Nate had gotten the email printed and framed, half as a joke, and kept it in his desk drawer like a lucky charm. "You're sure about the sizing?" Nate said, on the morning the position went live, standing in his kitchen in a tie Ethan had picked out for him, dark green, because Ethan had a vague memory of him wearing it the day everything had gone wrong before, and some superstitious part of him had wanted to see if changing the smallest details might change the outcome too. "I'm sure about the ruling," Ethan said. "Late October, it goes against Meridian. The stock spikes. You need Weller's name on the exposure before that happens, not after." "It's already there," Nate said, and something steady and grim had settled into his voice, the tone of a man who had stopped hoping the storm might miss him and started, instead, building the strongest possible shelter. "Priya's filed the preliminary review. If this goes the way you say it will, Weller's not walking away clean this time. Neither is Marcus's fear. Neither is any of it." 3 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday in the last week of October, the ruling came down against Meridian Resources exactly as Ethan remembered, and the stock did not merely spike. It detonated, climbing 34% in a single trading session, and Whitfield Cross Capital's short position, structured at Weller's explicit, documented instruction, lost the fund an amount of money that made the trading floor go silent, in a way Ethan had heard about only secondhand, in the life he remembered, from a man who no longer had a desk to sit at. This time, Ethan was in the building when it happened. In the lobby, actually, waiting nervously with a coffee he wasn't drinking, because Nate had asked him to come, had said quietly, the night before, "I want you there. Whatever happens." He watched the elevator numbers climb, 42, and felt his stomach twist with a fear that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the terrible familiar shape of watching someone he loved walk toward a disaster he couldn't fully protect them from. Nate came down 2 hours later, tie loosened, face pale but steady, and when he saw Ethan waiting, he didn't say anything at all. Just crossed the lobby in 6 long strides and pulled him into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked the air out of both of them. "Weller's suspended pending investigation," Nate said into his shoulder, voice rough with something that might have been relief or might have been the tail end of adrenaline. Compliance moved the second the loss hit. Marcus's statement, the emails, all of it, it's an open and shut case. They're already talking about him being as Eisen before this even goes public. He pulled back, hands still braced on Ethan's shoulders, and there were tears standing in his eyes that he didn't bother hiding. Not from Ethan, not anymore. "They asked me to give a statement. About the size of the position, I told them exactly what happened. Word for word, Ethan. I have never told anyone the exact truth that fast in my entire career. And I still have a job," Nate said. Disbelief and wonder tangled together in his voice. "I'm on administrative leave pending the review, which, fine, that's fair, that's how it works. But they're not treating me like the guy who tanked the fund. They're treating me like the guy who got set up, because there's paper, because for once there's paper." Ethan felt something in his chest release so completely he had to grip the front of Nate's t-shirt just to stay upright, months of quiet, gnawing terror finally letting go. "You're not disappearing," he said, half question, half prayer. "I'm not disappearing," Nate confirmed, and pulled him back into another hug, right there in the middle of the Prudential Tower lobby, in front of God and Gary the security guard and the entire indifferent churn of Boston's financial district. And Ethan let himself cry, just a little, into the shoulder of a man he had once stood over in a grave outside Providence, and now, impossibly, miraculously, got to keep. The weeks that followed the Meridian collapse were, by any objective measure, a mess. Internal investigations, a flurry of press coverage that painted Whitfield Cross Capital in exactly the unflattering light it deserved, Weller's quiet, ignominious resignation buried 3 paragraphs into a Financial Times article nobody but people in the industry would ever read. Ethan read that paragraph so many times the newsprint practically wore thin under his thumb, some old, superstitious part of him needing to see the words in print before he'd fully let himself believe they were real. But underneath the mess, something had shifted for good. Nate came back from administrative leave, not diminished, but, if anything, more respected, the desk's junior analysts treating him with a new, careful loyalty that came from having watched someone in power actually protect the people beneath him instead of sacrificing them. He started keeping his office door open more often. He started, for the first time since Ethan had known him, leaving the building before 7 most nights, and the first time he did it, Ethan had cried a little in the elevator down, quietly, gratefully, thinking of an apartment that had once been sublet out from under a man nobody had thought to check on. Marcus Webb, freed from the particular terror of a boss who owned his career, started smiling again by December. He brought Nate a 6-pack of good beer on his last day of administrative leave and said, awkwardly, "I don't really know how to thank you," and Nate had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Don't backdate anything ever again, that's plenty." And that had been that. Ethan, for his part, found himself with an unexpected new problem, the particular vertigo of a future that no longer had a script. He'd spent so long braced against the shape of a disaster he half remembered that its absence left a strange, unfamiliar quiet, the good kind, the kind he didn't quite know what to do with yet. "You've got that face again," Nate said, one evening in late November, the two of them tangled together on Nate's couch. String lights, Ethan had insisted on hanging around the windows, throwing soft gold light across the room. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle of the Boston skyline abandoned on the coffee table because they'd both gotten distracted arguing about whether the Citgo sign counted as a landmark. "What face?" "The one where you're doing math about a future I'm not invited into." Nate tugged him closer, chin resting on the top of his head. "Talk to me." Ethan considered, for a moment, deflecting, old habits, and then, because he'd promised himself months ago that he was done being a coward about the things that mattered, he didn't. "I don't know what happens now," he admitted. "I spent a year of my life grieving you and 11 months of this year trying to save you, and now you're saved and I don't actually know what a version of us that isn't running from a disaster looks like. I've never had that. Not with you." Nate was quiet for a moment, thumb tracing slow, absent circles against Ethan's shoulder, the same gesture he'd used the night Ethan had told him everything, months ago, kneeling on his kitchen floor. "I have an idea," Nate said finally. "Yeah?" "It looks like Sunday dinners at my mom's, and terrible jigsaw puzzle arguments, and you leaving your toothbrush at my place until one of us finally admits it might as well just live there permanently." His voice had gone soft, a little unsteady, the tone of a man saying something he'd been holding on to for a while, waiting for the right unremarkable moment. "It looks like actually getting old with you, Ethan. Not because we're racing some deadline you remember from a life I never got to live. Just because I want to. That's it. That's the whole plan." Ethan turned his head, found Nate's mouth in the low golden light, and kissed him slow and unhurried, the particular luxury of a kiss with nowhere urgent to be, no ticking clock counting down behind it. "That's a good plan," Ethan murmured against his mouth. "I have good instincts," Nate said, "occasionally, when I'm not being a stubborn idiot about elevator confessions. You cried in a lobby in front of Gary. We agreed never to speak of Gary again. It happened, in the end, nowhere near as dramatic as either of them would have predicted. Not on a mountaintop, not with a string quartet, not even particularly planned. It happened on a Tuesday in March, in the cramped galley kitchen of Nate's apartment, both of them still in pajamas, Ethan attempting, with limited success, to make his grandmother's stuffed shells recipe while Nate hovered uselessly with a wooden spoon he wasn't using for anything except gesturing. "You're doing the ricotta wrong," Nate said. "I am doing the ricotta exactly the way my nana taught me, and you would know that if you'd ever actually cooked anything more complicated than toast. I make excellent toast, that's not nothing. Hand me the basil." Nate handed him the basil. Ethan, mid-reach, glanced up and caught him not looking at the basil, not looking at the shells, not looking at anything except Ethan's face, with an expression so open and unguarded that Ethan's hands went still on the counter. "What?" Ethan asked. "Nothing." Nate shook his head, a small private smile tugging at his mouth. "I just keep doing that. Catching myself looking at you and thinking, oh, there he is. Like I misplaced you and found you again. Every single day. It hasn't stopped since the elevator." Ethan's throat went tight. "That's disgustingly sentimental for a man who insulted my nana's ricotta technique 30 seconds ago. I contain multitudes." Nate set the wooden spoon down, and something in the shift of his posture, small but unmistakable, made Ethan's pulse pick up. "Marry me." The basil fell out of Ethan's hand and scattered across the counter. "That's not. You can't just say that while I'm holding basil, Nathaniel. There's no ring, there's no—" "I have a ring," Nate said, and pulled a small velvet box out of the junk drawer. The actual junk drawer, the one with 3 dead batteries and a takeout menu from a restaurant that had closed 2 years ago, which was, Ethan would reflect later, so exactly, perfectly them that he started laughing before he'd even fully processed what was happening. "I've had it for 6 weeks. I was going to do something more elaborate. I had a whole plan involving the public garden and the swan boats. But then you started making your grandmother's shells and looked so annoyed about the ricotta, and I didn't want to wait for elaborate. I wanted to ask you now. While you're annoyed at me, because I love you when you're annoyed at me. I love you basically all the time, which is a fairly recent and alarming development for a guy who used to pride himself on emotional detachment. So." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, a plain band with a thin line of hammered texture, nothing showy, exactly Ethan's taste. "Marry me," present tense, ongoing, really annoyingly persistent. Ethan laughed, wet and helpless, using his own words back against him, and didn't bother wiping his eyes before he answered. "Yes," he said. "Obviously yes. Yes, you enormous, ridiculous, junk drawer romantic." Nate slid the ring onto his finger with hands that were shaking, just slightly, and when he kissed him, the stuffed shells burned, forgotten, on the stove behind them, and neither of them noticed for a full 5 minutes, and when they finally did, they ordered pizza instead and ate it on the kitchen floor, with the ring catching the light every time Ethan gestured, and it was, without question, the best ruined dinner of Ethan Carter's entire life. They got married the following October, 1 year to the week after Weller's resignation had quietly cleared the last shadow off both their lives, in the same craftsman house in Newton where Diane Hayes had once declared Ethan family over a box of cannoli. The backyard was strung with the same warm gold lights Ethan had hung around Nate's windows the winter they'd gotten engaged, the maple trees overhead just beginning to turn, dropping the occasional stray leaf onto the small rows of white folding chairs where Priya sat next to Marcus Webb, who had, somewhat improbably, become genuine friends with the man he'd once helped nearly ruin his own boss to protect, and where Marissa Hayes, standing as her brother's best man in a suit she'd insisted on picking out herself, kept loudly narrating the proceedings to anyone nearby, whether they'd asked or not. "He cried at the rehearsal dinner," she informed the row behind her. "Full tears. I have video." "You will delete that video," Nate said, without turning around. Tuxedo jacket pristine, hair actually behaving for once. "I absolutely will not." Ethan, waiting at the top of the aisle with Diane's hand tucked through his arm. She'd insisted, said something about needing to walk somebody down an aisle since her own son refused to let her fuss over him properly, and Ethan hadn't had the heart, or really the desire, to argue. Felt his chest fill with something too large for words as the string quartet shifted into the opening bars and the small crowd rose to their feet. Nate was waiting at the end of the aisle in the gold October light, and when their eyes met, he didn't bother composing his expression into anything dignified. Just let the whole helpless, undone shape of his love show plainly on his face, the way he'd stopped hiding anything from Ethan somewhere around a kitchen floor covered in pizza crumbs and an engagement ring. "You clean up nice, Carter?" Nate murmured, once Ethan reached him. Once Diane had pressed a kiss to both their cheeks and taken her seat, dabbing carefully at her eyes. "You cried at the rehearsal dinner. We agreed never to speak of that. We agreed never to speak of Gary, and yet," Ethan said, and Nate laughed, right there at the altar, bright and unguarded, and the officiant had to actually pause and wait for them both to stop grinning at each other like idiots before the ceremony could properly begin. They wrote their own vows. Nate's were, predictably, more elegant than he gave himself credit for, full of careful analyst's precision turned, for once, towards something that couldn't be modeled or hedged. Ethan's were shorter and simpler, and the only part that mattered, the part that made Diane openly cry and Marissa pretend she wasn't, was this: "I already lost you once, in a life only I remember," Ethan said, voice steady despite the tears standing in his eyes. "And I spent longer than I want to admit thinking that loss was the price I had to pay for having been too much of a coward to love you out loud the first time around. I don't believe that anymore. I think love isn't something you get exactly one chance at and then forfeit if you're too scared to take it. I think, if you're lucky, and God, Nathaniel Hayes, I am the luckiest man in Boston, you get to keep choosing it, every single ordinary day, present tense, ongoing, for the rest of your life, so that's my vow. Not some big, sweeping, one-time thing. Just, I choose you, today, and tomorrow." And every unremarkable Tuesday after that, Nate didn't manage to get through his own vows without his voice breaking twice, and nobody in the small, gold-lit backyard in Newton held it against him even slightly. They danced their first dance to something slow and a little corny that Marissa had chosen without asking either of them, and Ethan didn't mind at all, because it meant he got to spend 4 unhurried minutes with his face tucked against his husband's shoulder, breathing in cedar and clean laundry, present tense, finally, permanently, safely present tense. 3 years later, the apartment on Beacon Hill, theirs now, jointly, after a protracted and genuinely unhinged argument about paint colors that Ethan had won by sheer stubbornness, smelled like burnt garlic bread because Nathaniel Hayes, despite 3 years of marriage and considerable coaching, still could not be trusted within 10 feet of an oven timer. "It's a little burnt," Nate called from the kitchen, waving a dish towel at the smoke detector with the particular guilty energy of a man who knew exactly how this argument would end. "It's a lot burnt," Ethan said, coming in from the living room in sweatpants and one of Nate's old college rowing shirts, surveying the smoking baking sheet with the weary fondness of a man who had genuinely, deeply, ridiculously chosen this life on purpose. "This is the 3rd time this month, Nathaniel. I was on a call. Marissa needed emotional support regarding a resident who keeps stealing her lunch. You could turn the timer off during your calls." "I could," Nate agreed, entirely unbothered, pulling the ruined garlic bread out and dumping the whole thing directly into the trash with the casual confidence of a man who managed hundreds of millions of dollars in assets for a living and could not, apparently, manage a toaster oven. "But then how would you get to make that face at me? I live for that face. That's deeply unhealthy. We're getting Thai instead," Nate announced, already pulling out his phone, already dialing the place 3 blocks down that knew their order by heart at this point. "Don't pretend you're mad. You love it when I burn dinner. Gives you a reason to make fun of me for an entire evening." He wasn't wrong, which was, Ethan reflected, possibly the single most annoying thing about being married to Nathaniel Hayes. The man had an infuriating habit of being correct about Ethan's own feelings roughly 90% of the time. "I don't love it," Ethan said, entirely unconvincingly, leaning against the counter while Nate placed the order, watching the easy, familiar motion of his husband's hands, the ring on his finger that still, 3 years on, caught Ethan's eye and made something warm settle behind his ribs every single time. "I tolerate it. There's a difference." "Sure there is." Nate hung up, crossed the kitchen, and pulled Ethan into him with the same unhurried confidence he'd had since a coffee-stained lobby 3 years and 1 lifetime ago, resting his chin against the top of Ethan's head. 20 minutes on the pad thai. Marissa's coming by after her shift. She says she has devastating hospital gossip, whatever that means. Mom wants to know if we're free Sunday, and he pulled back just enough to catch Ethan's eye, something soft and a little mischievous crossing his face. "I signed us up for a couple's cooking class. Starts next week. I figure it's either that or we accept Thai food as our permanent 3rd roommate. You are banned from operating any appliance with a flame. That's exactly why I signed us up. Professional supervision." Ethan laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh he'd once thought he'd lost the right to, back in a life that had ended on a rain-slicked stretch of highway outside Providence, back before a second chance had handed him back every ordinary Tuesday he'd once grieved as permanently, irretrievably lost. "Fine," he said, tipping his head back for a kiss that Nate gave him immediately, unhesitating, the same way he'd been giving Ethan everything, unhesitating, since a lobby, a shirt, a milk crate on a loading dock, cooking class. "But if you set off the smoke alarm in front of an instructor, I'm telling Marissa, and you know she'll never let you live it down." "Worth it," Nate said, entirely without regret, pressing one more kiss to Ethan's temple as the smoke detector, finally, mercifully, went quiet behind them. "Everything's worth it, as long as it's you." Outside, Beacon Hill's gas lamps flickered on one by one against the coming dusk, and somewhere 3 blocks away a delivery driver was already threading through evening traffic with 2 orders of pad thai, and none of it was dramatic. None of it was a headline. None of it was the kind of thing anyone would remember in a year or 10. And that, Ethan understood now, standing in a burnt, garlic bread kitchen in the arms of a man he had once buried and gotten, impossibly, to unbury, was exactly the point. Ordinary Tuesdays, present tense, ongoing. No more disappearing, no more 4-word goodbyes at 2 in the morning. Just this, just them, just every unremarkable day he'd once thought he'd lost the right to have, for the rest of their lives.